In the upscale neighborhoods of Chicago, where million-dollar homes line pristine streets, a homeless plumber named Marcus wanders through the bitter December cold. His weathered hands carry a simple toolbox, and his empty stomach reminds him it's been 2 days since his last meal. When he notices water flooding from beneath the wrought-iron gates of a grand mansion, he makes a desperate offer to the woman inside: fix her burst pipes in exchange for a warm meal. What Marcus doesn't know is that Victoria Hartwell, the woman who answers the door, is worth $3 billion and hasn't trusted another human being in over a decade. She's built an empire but lost her faith in people along the way. But will one act of honest work and humble hunger change both their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through Marcus Delacroix's threadbare coat like a blade through paper, each gust a reminder of how far he had fallen. 6 months ago, he had owned Delacroix Plumbing Solutions, a thriving business that employed 12 men and had contracts throughout Chicago's South Side. 6 months ago, he had lived in a modest but comfortable home with Sarah, planning their retirement and talking about the grandchildren they hoped to spoil someday. 6 months ago, the world had made sense. Now Marcus pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his graying temples and adjusted the weight of his grandfather's toolbox, the only possession of real value he had left. The leather handle, polished smooth by 3 generations of working hands, felt familiar in his grip. Inside, carefully maintained despite everything, lay the tools that had fed his family for 30 years. The pipe wrenches his father had given him as a wedding gift, the level that had never failed him, the small flashlight that had illuminated countless dark crawl spaces. The homeless shelter on Michigan Avenue had been full again last night. Marcus had spent the early morning hours in the 24-hour diner on Clark Street, nursing a single cup of coffee and watching the sun rise over a city that no longer felt like home. The waitress, a kind woman named Rosa, who had learned his story over the past month, had slipped him 2 slices of toast when her manager wasn't looking. It was the only food he'd had since yesterday afternoon. As he walked through Lincoln Park, Marcus couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his current circumstances and the world around him. Elegant townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing warmly in the morning light. Professional people in expensive coats hurried past him without making eye contact, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He had once been one of them, not wealthy perhaps, but respected, stable, secure in his place in the world. The memory of Sarah's final hospital bills still made his chest tighten. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments had cost everything. He had mortgaged the business, sold their home, liquidated their retirement savings. Nothing had been too much if it meant 1 more month, 1 more week, 1 more day with the woman who had been his anchor for 28 years. When she died anyway, the financial house of cards had collapsed swiftly and completely. Marcus stopped walking as something caught his attention. Water. A lot of it, streaming from beneath. The ornate iron gates of what was clearly one of the neighborhood's most impressive mansions. The 3-story brick structure sat behind perfectly manicured grounds, its windows gleaming like jewelry against the morning sky. But water was flowing steadily from the foundation, creating dark stains on the pristine sidewalk and forming small rivers that ran toward the storm drains. Inside that house, Victoria Hartwell stood at her office window, watching the water with growing alarm. At 47, she had inherited the Hartwell Industries empire from her father 8 years ago, and had transformed it from a regional construction company into a multinational corporation worth billions. She had survived boardroom coups, hostile takeover attempts, and the constant pressure of managing 12,000 employees across 4 countries. But the sight of water pouring from her home's foundation made her feel helpless in a way that corporate warfare never had. The mansion had been in her family for 3 generations, a monument to Hartwell's success and ambition. Her great-grandfather had built it in 1923, her grandfather had renovated it in the 50s, and her father had added the modern security systems and climate controls that now seem to be failing spectacularly. Victoria had grown up in these rooms, but they had never felt like home. More like a museum where she happened to sleep. She pressed the intercom button on her desk with more force than necessary. "Margaret, get me the emergency plumber, the expensive one. Tell them it's urgent." Her assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. "I've been trying for 20 minutes, Ms. Hartwell. They're backed up with emergency calls because of the cold snap. The earliest they can get here is Thursday." "Thursday?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "That's 3 days away. This house will be flooded by then." Through the window, she watched a figure approach the gate. A man in a worn coat, carrying what looked like a toolbox. He stopped at the edge of her property and studied the water flow with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was seeing. Something about his posture, the way he crouched down to examine the problem, suggested expertise. Victoria had learned long ago to trust her instincts about people, though those instincts usually warned her to be suspicious. In her world, everyone wanted something, a contract, an investment, a favorable decision from the Hartwell Industries board. Her father's portrait hung behind her desk, a constant reminder of his favorite piece of advice: trust, but verify, and when in doubt, don't trust at all. But watching this stranger examine her flooded property, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity about another person's motives that wasn't immediately defensive. Marcus had seen enough. The problem was clear. A burst. Pipe in the main line, probably due to the sudden temperature drop. The foundation was old enough that the pipes might not have been properly insulated during the last renovation. Without immediate attention, the water would undermine the foundation and potentially cause structural damage that would cost hundreds of thousands to repair. He looked up at the imposing mansion, noting the security cameras that tracked his movement, and the intercom system by the gate. This was clearly the home of someone with means, someone who could afford to fix problems like this without thinking twice about the cost. Someone who probably wouldn't give a homeless man the time of day, much less trust him with expensive repairs. But Marcus was hungry, and he was cold, and he was tired of being invisible. More than that, he was tired of feeling useless. For 30 years, he had been the man people called when things broke down. He had been reliable, competent, respected. He had fixed problems that seemed impossible, and earned the gratitude of families who depended on him. That identity hadn't disappeared just because his bank account had. Taking a deep breath, Marcus approached the intercom and pressed the button. The response was immediate, as if someone had been waiting. "Yes?" The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably female. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you have a significant water problem out here. I'm a licensed plumber, and I can see exactly what's wrong. If you're having trouble getting someone out here quickly, I might be able to help." There was a long pause. Marcus could almost feel the woman on the other end of the intercom weighing her options, probably looking at him through one of the security cameras. He straightened his shoulders and tried to look as professional as possible in his worn clothes. "What kind of help?" The voice was cautious but not dismissive. "Your main line has burst, probably due to the cold. It's going to get worse fast, and the water's already starting to undermine your foundation. I can have it fixed in a couple of hours, but it needs to be done now." Another pause. Marcus added, "I'm not asking for money, ma'am, just I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I could use a warm meal. If you could spare some food, I'd be grateful for the work." The honesty of his admission surprised even him. He had meant to sound more professional, more capable. Instead, he had revealed his desperation to a stranger who had no reason to care about his problems. Victoria stared at the security monitor, studying the man's face. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years, of worry. His clothes were clean but worn, his posture straight despite what were obviously difficult circumstances. There was something in his expression, a dignity that hadn't been broken by whatever had brought him to her gate. She thought about the emergency plumbers who charged triple rates and often left bigger messes than they found. She thought about the contractors who saw her wealth as an opportunity to inflate their bills. She thought about the board meeting she had scheduled for this afternoon and how she would explain to 12 skeptical executives why she couldn't keep her own house from flooding. Most of all, she thought about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. It had been months since she had spoken to anyone who didn't want something from her, who wasn't calculating the advantage they might gain from their interaction with Victoria Hartwell, CEO and heiress. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Delacroix." "Ma'am, Mr. Delacroix, I'm going to open the gate. Come to the front door." As the ornate iron gates swung open with a soft mechanical hum, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was about to enter a world he no longer belonged to, carrying his grandfather's tools and his own tattered pride. He didn't know that the woman waiting behind the heavy oak door was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. The mansion's front door was as imposing as the rest of the structure. Thick oak panels with brass fittings that probably cost more than Marcus used to make in a month. He lifted the heavy knocker and let it fall twice, the sound echoing in the cold morning air. The door opened to reveal a woman who was simultaneously exactly what Marcus had expected, and nothing like he had imagined. Victoria Hartwell was dressed in a perfectly tailored business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a way that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. She was beautiful in the way that successful, powerful women often were. Polished, composed, intimidating. But there was something else in her expression, a wariness that suggested she had been disappointed by people before. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Hartwell. Thank you for stopping." Her handshake was firm, businesslike, but Marcus noticed that she studied his face as they shook hands, as if trying to read his character in his features. "Thank you for listening, Ms. Hartwell. I know this is unusual." "Yes, it is." She stepped back to let him enter. "But unusual. Circumstances sometimes require unusual solutions. Show me what you think is wrong." Victoria led Marcus through the mansion's grand foyer, past marble columns and oil paintings that had probably been in her family for generations. Marcus tried not to gawk at the opulence surrounding him, but he couldn't help noticing the craftsmanship. In the crown molding, the quality of the hardwood floors, the way everything had been designed to impress and intimidate. This wasn't just a home. It was a statement of power and wealth that few people would ever see from the inside. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the rear of the house. Victoria pushed open a door that led to what had once been an elegant sitting room but was now partially flooded. Water cascaded down one wall, pooling on antique Persian rugs and lapping at the legs of furniture that Marcus suspected cost more than most people's cars. It started about an hour ago, Victoria said, her composure cracking slightly as she surveyed the damage. "I heard what sounded like rain, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky." Marcus set down his toolbox and knelt beside the wall where the water was flowing most heavily. He pulled out a small flashlight, his grandfather's, with a brass body that had developed a warm patina over decades of use, and examined the baseboard. The wood was swelling and warping, and he could see where the water was seeping through from behind. "The pipe burst inside the wall," he said, running his fingers along the baseboard to trace the water's path. "Probably happened when the temperature had dropped so suddenly last night. Old houses like this, sometimes the insulation around the pipes isn't what it should be." He stood and moved to the adjacent wall, checking for additional damage. "The good news is, it's isolated to this section. The bad news is that every minute we wait, more water is getting behind your walls and under your floors. This kind of damage can spread fast." Victoria watched him work, noting the methodical way he examined the problem, the confidence in his movements despite his obvious circumstances. "What needs to be done?" "I need to shut off the water to this section of the house, then cut into the wall to access the broken pipe. Once I can see what we're dealing with, I can make the repair and get the water flowing again." He paused, looking directly at her. "But I need to be honest with you, Miss Hartwell. This is going to require cutting into your wall, and there's no way to do it without making a mess. When I'm finished, you'll need someone to repair the drywall and repaint. How long will it take?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "If it's a simple burst, which is what I think it is, maybe 2 hours for the plumbing work. The wall repair is a job for another day." Victoria looked at the water continuing to pour down her wall, then at the man who had appeared at her gate like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. "Do it." For the next 2 hours, Marcus worked with the focused intensity that had made him successful for 3 decades. He shut off the water, used a reciprocating saw to carefully cut away a section of drywall, and exposed the burst pipe behind the wall. Victoria found herself fascinated by his process, the way he explained each step as he worked, his obvious expertise, the care he took to minimize damage to her home. The antique pipe wrench he used had belonged to his grandfather, a tool forged in an era when things were built to last forever. As Marcus worked, he found himself thinking about the old man who had taught him that plumbing wasn't just about pipes and water. It was about understanding how things worked, how they fit together, how to fix what was broken with patience and skill. "This is beautiful craftsmanship," he said, examining the original copper pipes. "They don't make them like this anymore. Your great-grandfather, whoever installed this system, he knew what he was doing." Victoria, who had been watching from a safe distance, stepped closer. "You can tell when it was installed? The fittings, the way the joints are soldered. This is 1920s work, maybe early 30s. See this maker's mark here? This company hasn't existed since the Depression. Whoever your great-grandfather hired, he used the best materials available." As Marcus replaced the burst section with modern pipe, he found himself talking more than he had in months. Maybe it was the relief of doing work he understood, or maybe it was the way Victoria listened. Not just politely, but with genuine interest in what he was saying. "I had a business," he said, carefully fitting the new pipe into place. "Nothing like this, but we did good work. Honest work. I always told my guys that when you're working in someone's home, you're not just fixing their pipes, you're taking care of the place where they make their memories." Victoria found herself hanging on his words. When was the last time someone had spoken to her about work with such genuine passion? The contractors she usually dealt with spoke in terms of costs and schedules, not craftsmanship and care. "What happened to your business?" she asked softly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, focusing on tightening a joint. "My wife got sick. Cancer. The treatment was expensive and insurance only covered so much. I mortgaged everything to pay for experimental procedures, hoping for more time with her." He paused, testing the connection for leaks. "She died anyway, and I lost everything trying to save her." The simple honesty of his statement hit Victoria harder than she had expected. She had been surrounded by tragedy in her business life. Companies failing, people losing jobs, economic upheaval that affected thousands of lives. But those had been abstract problems, numbers on spreadsheets, distant consequences of corporate decisions. Marcus's loss was immediate, personal, devastating in its simplicity. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. "Thank you." Marcus turned the water back on and checked his work. No leaks. "She would have liked you, I think. Sarah always said you could tell a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them." By the time Marcus finished the repair, something had shifted between them. What had started as a transaction, work for food, had become something more complex. Victoria had watched a master craftsman restore function to her home, with tools that were clearly treasured family heirlooms. Marcus had found himself in conversation with a woman who, despite her wealth and power, listened with genuine interest to what he had to say. "Let me make you something to eat," Victoria said, as Marcus packed his tools. She led him to a kitchen that was larger than some apartments, equipped with professional-grade appliances that looked like they had rarely been used. Victoria opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents with the expression of someone facing an unfamiliar challenge. "I should probably confess," she said with a slight smile, "I don't actually cook much. My housekeeper usually handles meals, but she's visiting her daughter this week." Marcus joined her at the refrigerator, surveying the ingredients with a practiced eye. "Mind if I make a suggestion? You've got everything here for a good soup." For the next hour, Marcus guided Victoria through the process of making chicken soup from scratch. He chopped vegetables while she stirred the pot, both of them laughing when she accidentally added too much salt and they had to dilute the broth with more water. It was the first time Victoria had cooked a meal in her own kitchen, and the first time in months that Marcus had felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with desperation. When they finally sat down to eat at her massive dining room table, the bowl of simple soup between them seemed to bridge the enormous gap in their circumstances. Victoria asked about his life before homelessness, and Marcus found himself telling stories about his customers, his employees, the satisfaction of solving problems that seemed impossible. "You remind me of my grandfather," Victoria said. "He started this company with nothing but a truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days. He used to say that the difference between successful people and everyone else wasn't talent or luck. It was the willingness to keep working when everything fell apart." Marcus looked around the dining room, with its crystal chandelier and oil paintings worth more than he used to make in a year. "Looks like he was right." "Maybe," Victoria said quietly, "but I'm not sure success is the same thing as happiness." As the afternoon wore on, neither of them seemed eager to end the conversation. Victoria asked about Marcus's techniques, his tools, his philosophy of craftsmanship. Marcus asked about her business, her responsibilities, the challenges of managing an empire built by previous generations. When Marcus finally stood to leave, Victoria walked him to the front door with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, as he shouldered his toolbox, "if you ever need work, please don't hesitate to call me. You do excellent work." Marcus nodded, knowing that this was probably the end of the most meaningful conversation he'd had since Sarah's death. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell, for the meal, for trusting me with your home. You're a kind woman." As the front door closed behind him, both Marcus and Victoria felt the weight of an opportunity that might not come again. They had found, in each other's company, something that had been missing from their lives, genuine human connection based not on what they could do for each other, but on who they were beneath the circumstances that had brought them together. Marcus walked back through the iron gates into the December cold, but something had changed. For the first time in months, he felt like Marcus Delacroix, master plumber, instead of just another homeless man hoping for charity. And behind her mansion's walls, Victoria stood at her office window, watching him disappear down the street and wondering why the house suddenly felt so empty. 3 days had passed since Marcus fixed Victoria's burst pipe, and she found herself thinking about their conversation more often than she cared to admit. Sitting in her corner office on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Industries building, surrounded by the familiar trappings of corporate power, Victoria couldn't shake the memory of how natural it had felt to cook soup with a man she barely knew. Her assistant knocked and entered with the morning's priority files. "Ms. Hartwell, the Morrison acquisition documents are ready for your review, and the board wants your decision on the Phoenix development by Friday." Victoria nodded absently, signing documents without her usual careful attention. Her mind kept drifting to Marcus's weathered hands as he worked on her pipes, the way he had spoken about his late wife with such gentle reverence, the pride in his voice when he described his lost business. After Margaret left, Victoria did something she had Never done before in her professional life, she used company resources for a personal inquiry, a few phone calls to contacts in the city's licensing department, a conversation with a retired contractor who had worked in Chicago for decades, and a careful review of public bankruptcy records painted a picture that made her chest tighten. With unexpected emotion, Marcus Delacroix had indeed owned a successful plumbing business. For nearly 30 years, Delacroix Plumbing Solutions had built a reputation for quality work and fair prices. Customer reviews, even from several years ago, consistently praised Marcus's integrity, skill, and the way he treated people's homes. With respect, the business had employed 12 people at its peak, had contracts with several major property management companies, and had maintained an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Then, 18 months ago, everything had collapsed. Medical bills totaling over $300,000, a second mortgage on both his business and personal property, maxed out credit cards, and finally, bankruptcy. The business had been sold to pay creditors, the equipment auctioned off, the employees scattered to other companies. 6 months later, Sarah Delacroix had died at Northwestern Memorial Hospital after a valiant fight against stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Victoria leaned back in her leather chair and stared out at the Chicago skyline. She had made her fortune, understanding markets, reading financial statements, and calculating risks. But numbers had never told her such a heartbreaking story of love and loss. Marcus hadn't been irresponsible or foolish. He had simply loved his wife more than he valued his own financial security. That evening, Victoria sat in her mansion's dining room with a catered meal she barely touched in the same chair where she had shared soup with Marcus 3 days earlier. The house felt cavernous around her, filled with expensive furniture and priceless art, but empty of the warmth that had filled it during those few hours of genuine conversation. She reached for her phone twice, then stopped. What would she say? That she had investigated his background, that she couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, that she was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. Meanwhile, Marcus spent his days walking the streets of Chicago, his toolbox a familiar weight in his hand. Word had somehow spread among the wealthy neighborhoods that there was a skilled plumber available for emergency work, and he had fixed 3 separate problems in the past week. Each job paid enough for a few nights in a cheap motel, a hot shower, and regular meals. Mrs. Chen on Astor Street had needed her kitchen sink repaired. Dr. Reynolds in the Gold Coast had a clogged drain that other plumbers couldn't clear. An elderly widower named Mr. Patterson had hired Marcus to replace a water heater, then insisted on paying him twice what he had asked because good work deserves good pay. Each job reminded Marcus of who he used to be, of the satisfaction that came from solving problems and helping people. But every evening, when the work was done and he was alone again, his thoughts returned to Victoria Hartwell and the unexpected connection they had shared. On Thursday morning, Victoria's resolve finally cracked. She told Margaret to clear her, scheduled for the afternoon, then drove to Lincoln Park with no clear plan beyond hoping to find Marcus. She felt foolish, like a teenager with a crush, but the need for genuine human connection had become stronger than her usual caution. She found him 3 blocks from her mansion, working on the front steps of a Victorian townhouse. He was replacing a frozen outdoor spigot, his grandfather's tools arranged neatly on a clean cloth beside him. Victoria parked across the street and watched him work, noting the care he took to protect the homeowner's landscaping, the way he cleaned up each small mess as he made it. When Marcus finished the job and collected his tools, Victoria approached him with her heart beating faster than it had during her last board presentation. "Mr. Delacroix," she called softly. Marcus turned, and his face lit up with a smile that made Victoria's chest warm. "Miss Hartwell, what a pleasant surprise." "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which was technically true since she lived nearby. "I wanted to thank you again for your help the other day. The wall repair went smoothly, and there's been no sign of further problems. I'm glad to hear it. Marcus shouldered his toolbox, and Victoria noticed that his coat looked cleaner, his posture straighter. The work was clearly good for him. How are you doing? The simple question, asked with genuine interest, nearly undid Victoria's careful composure. When was the last time someone had asked how she was doing and actually wanted to know the answer? I'm well, she said automatically, then stopped. Something about Marcus's patient expression invited honesty. Actually, I've been thinking about our conversation, about what you said about taking care of the places where people make their memories. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It's something my grandfather taught me. He used to say that a man's home is more than just walls and pipes. It's where he becomes, who he's meant to be. Victoria found herself walking beside him as they moved down the sidewalk, neither of them acknowledging the strangeness of a billionaire CEO strolling through Lincoln Park with a homeless plumber. I've been wondering, Victoria said carefully, about your plans. I mean, what you hope to do next. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his words. I'm taking it one day at a time. The work feels good, being useful again, using skills I thought I might have lost. But I'll be honest with you, Ms. Hartwell, I'm 54 years old, and starting over isn't getting any easier. They stopped at a small coffee shop, and Victoria surprised herself by suggesting they go inside, over steaming cups and pastries. That Marcus initially refused but eventually accepted, Victoria found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. She talked about the isolation of inherited wealth, the way people's behavior changed the moment they learned her last name. She described board meetings where she was the only woman, corporate decisions that affected thousands of lives, the constant pressure of maintaining an empire built by men who had died before she was born. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. Like I'm playing a role that was written for me before I was old enough to choose. Marcus listened with the same focused attention he brought to his work. What would you choose? If you could start over, the question caught Victoria off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted, separate from what was expected of her. I don't know, she said finally. I've never allowed myself to think about it. As they sat in the coffee shop, surrounded by the comfortable buzz of normal people, living normal lives, both Marcus and Victoria felt something they hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of being understood by another person, not because of their circumstances, but despite them. When they finally parted ways, Victoria impulsively handed Marcus her personal business card. If you need anything, she said. Anything at all. Marcus looked at the card. Heavy stock, elegant. Lettering? Her private number written in her own handwriting on the back. Thank you, he said simply. This means more than you know. As Victoria drove home to her empty mansion, she realized she was already hoping for a reason to see Marcus again, and as Marcus walked back toward the shelter, her card carefully tucked into his wallet, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, starting over didn't have to mean starting alone. The call came on a Friday morning while Victoria was reviewing quarterly reports. Marcus's voice on her private line was hesitant, apologetic. Ms. Hartwell, I hope I'm not disturbing you. It's Marcus Delacroix. Victoria's pulse quickened, and she immediately minimized the spreadsheet on her computer screen. Not at all, Marcus. Is everything all right? I have a situation, and I wasn't sure who else to call. There's a woman here at the shelter, elderly, diabetic, and her apartment's been without heat for 3 days. The landlord won't fix it, says she's behind on rent. I can repair the furnace, but I need some parts and... His voice trailed off, embarrassment clear even over the phone. You need money for the parts, Victoria finished gently. I hate to ask, but this woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, she's going to end up in the hospital if she spends another night in that cold apartment. Victoria was already reaching for her coat. What's the address? I'll meet you there. An hour later, Victoria found herself in a neighborhood she had never visited, despite living in Chicago her entire life. The apartment building was a tired brick structure with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Marcus was waiting on the front steps, his toolbox beside him and a bag of furnace parts at his feet. "You didn't have to come," he said as she approached. "I could have handled this." "I know," Victoria replied, looking around at the urban decay surrounding them. "But I wanted to see what you were talking about." Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment was on the third floor, up a stairwell that smelled of dampness and neglect. The elderly woman who answered the door was wrapped in multiple blankets, her breath visible in the frigid air of her own living room. "This is Ms. Hartwell," Marcus said in fluent Spanish, surprising Victoria. "She's helping us get your heat working again." While Marcus worked on the ancient furnace in a basement that was more like a dungeon, Victoria sat with Mrs. Rodriguez and learned about her life. The woman had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, raised 5 children in this same apartment, and now survived on Social Security that barely covered her rent and medications. Her landlord, she explained through a mixture of Spanish and broken English, was waiting for her to miss enough rent payments to justify an eviction. "He wants to renovate, charge more money," Mrs. Rodriguez said sadly. "I understand, but where do I go?" Victoria found herself genuinely moved by the woman's dignity in the face of such uncertainty. When Marcus emerged from the basement 2 hours later, covered in dust but triumphant, the apartment was already growing warm. "The furnace is 20 years past its expiration date," he told Victoria as they walked back to their cars. "I've patched it together, but it won't last the winter." Victoria was quiet for a moment, processing what she had witnessed. What would a new furnace cost? For this building? Maybe $8,000 installed properly. And the landlord won't pay for it, Marcus shook his head. He's hoping the tenants will leave on their own, cheaper than formal evictions. That evening, Victoria did something that would have shocked her board of directors. She called the building's owner and offered to buy the property for twice its assessed value. The surprised landlord accepted immediately, probably assuming he was dealing with a developer who would tear down the building and start over. Victoria's real plan was simpler: ensure that Mrs. Rodriguez and the other elderly tenants could live in dignity without fear of displacement. It wasn't charity exactly. It was an investment in the kind of world she wanted to help create. She called Marcus that night to tell him about the furnace replacement she had arranged. His reaction surprised her. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but his voice was warm with gratitude. "I know, but it felt like the right thing to do." "Sarah would have liked you," Marcus said quietly. "She always said that people with means have a responsibility to use them well." "Tell me about her," Victoria said, settling into her favorite chair with a glass of wine. For the next hour, Marcus shared memories of his late wife. Sarah had been a teacher, patient and kind, with a gift for making everyone around her feel valued. She had supported Marcus's decision to start his own business, had been his partner in every sense of the word. Even during her illness, she had worried more about the financial burden on Marcus than her own suffering. "She made me promise," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "that if something happened to her, I wouldn't give up on life, that I would find a way to be happy again." "Have you?" Victoria asked softly. "I'm trying. These past few weeks, helping people, talking with you. It's the first time since she died that I've felt like myself again." After they hung up, Victoria sat in her mansion's silence and thought about purpose. She had inherited vast wealth and the responsibility that came with it, but she had never felt the simple satisfaction that Marcus clearly derived from helping Mrs. Rodriguez stay warm. The next morning brought an unexpected call from her estate manager. "Ms. Hartwell, we have a situation with the groundskeeper. He gave notice yesterday. Family emergency back in Guatemala. I can find a replacement, but it might take a few weeks." Victoria looked out her office window at the mansion's extensive grounds, and an idea began to form. "Actually, I might have someone in mind. Let me make a few calls." When she called Marcus, she tried to keep her voice casual. "I have a proposition for you. I need someone to manage my estate's maintenance, not just groundskeeping, but all the mechanical systems, repairs, that sort of thing. There's a guest cottage on the property that comes with the position. Marcus was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if the connection had been lost. Miss Hartwell, he said finally, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity. It's not charity, Victoria said firmly. It's a job offer. The guest cottage hasn't been properly maintained in years, and I need someone I can trust to oversee the entire property. You're the most skilled craftsman I've ever met, and you're someone I know will treat my home with respect. What would the salary be? Victoria named a figure that was generous, but not so high as to seem like disguised charity. Plus the cottage, utilities and full benefits. Marcus was quiet again, and Victoria held her breath. Could I see the cottage first? He asked. Of course. When would you like to come by? How about now? An hour later, Victoria led Marcus along a stone path that wound through the mansion's formal gardens to a small brick cottage tucked among mature oak trees. The building was charming, but clearly needed attention. Peeling paint, loose shutters, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. It needs work, Victoria said apologetically. Marcus walked around the cottage with a professional eye, checking the foundation, examining the roofline, testing the front door's hinges. Good bones, he said finally. The structure is sound. Everything else is just maintenance, so you'll take the job. Marcus looked at the cottage, then at the mansion visible through the trees, then at Victoria's hopeful expression. Around his neck, beneath his shirt, Sarah's wedding ring rested against his chest, a reminder of love lost, but also of promises made. I'll take the job, he said, extending his hand to shake on the agreement. When do I start? How about tomorrow? Victoria said, unable to hide her smile. As they shook hands in the shadow of the cottage that would become Marcus's new home, both of them felt the weight of a decision that was about much more than employment. They were choosing to trust each other, to believe that two people from vastly different worlds might find something valuable in each other's company. Neither of them fully understood yet how completely this choice would change their lives. Marcus moved into the cottage on a crisp Tuesday morning in January, carrying everything he owned in 2 duffel bags and his grandfather's toolbox. Victoria had offered to help him shop for furniture, but Marcus politely declined, saying he preferred to acquire things gradually to make sure each piece felt right in the space. The cottage was larger than it had appeared from outside. 2 bedrooms, a compact kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace that Marcus immediately began planning to restore. Most importantly, it had excellent natural light and felt like a place where a person could think clearly. Victoria found excuses to visit the cottage daily during Marcus's first week. She brought coffee while he worked on the leaky kitchen faucet, consulted with him about the mansion's temperamental heating system, and asked his advice about winterizing the estate's outdoor water features. Both of them knew these weren't emergencies that required immediate attention, but neither mentioned the obvious. On Saturday morning, Victoria discovered something that changed her understanding of Marcus entirely. She had come to the cottage to discuss a problem with the mansion's security system when she found him in the cottage's back garden, kneeling among the overgrown flower beds with a reverence that bordered on worship. Sarah loved gardening, Marcus said without looking up. His hands were already dirty, working to clear dead growth from what had once been carefully planned perennial beds. She said flowers were proof that beauty could grow from the ugliest dirt if you just gave it enough attention. Victoria knelt beside him, not caring that the damp earth would stain her expensive jeans. What did she grow? Everything. Roses? Definitely. She had this climbing rose that covered our entire back fence. Tomatoes in the summer, herbs year-round. She could make anything grow. Marcus paused, holding a handful of dead stems. I haven't touched a garden since she died. It hurt too much, remembering. And now, Marcus looked around the cottage garden, seeing potential where Victoria saw only weeds and neglect. Now I think maybe she'd want me to try again. She always said that gardens were about hope, planting something today because you believe tomorrow will be worth seeing. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself drawn to the cottage garden like a magnet. She would arrive with coffee and pastries from the bakery on Michigan Avenue, then spend hours working alongside Marcus as he slowly brought the space back to life. He taught her to recognize the difference between weeds and dormant perennials, showed her how to prepare soil for spring planting, explained the patience required to nurture something from seed to bloom. Victoria discovered she had a natural affinity for the work. Her hands, accustomed to signing contracts and operating computer keyboards, adapted quickly to the more elemental tasks of planting and pruning. More importantly, she found the physical labor strangely therapeutic, a respite from the mental complexity of managing a corporate empire. "You have good instincts," Marcus told her one afternoon, as they planned the layout for a new herb garden. "Sarah always said that some people are natural gardeners, not because they know all the rules, but because they understand what plants need to thrive." The comment pleased Victoria more than any board commendation ever had, but their growing partnership wasn't happening in a vacuum. Victoria's assistant, Margaret, had noticed her boss's frequent absences and unusual preoccupation. The Hartwell Industries board was growing restless about several pending decisions that Victoria seemed reluctant to finalize. Most concerning of all, Victoria's Uncle Charles, her father's younger brother, and the company's chief financial officer, had begun asking pointed questions about Victoria's judgment and leadership priorities. "She's been distracted," Charles told board member Robert Simmons over lunch at the Union League Club, "missing meetings, delegating decisions she should be making herself. And there's this homeless man she's hired to work on her estate. The staff is talking." Simmons, who had served on the Hartwell Industries board for 15 years, raised an eyebrow. "Homeless man? Living in the cottage behind her house now. I'm told she spends considerable time with him. It's unusual behavior, even for Victoria." Charles. Hartwell had spent 20 years in his older brother's shadow, watching as the family business passed to the next generation, instead of to him. He had accepted his role as CFO gracefully, but he had never stopped believing that he would have been a better choice to lead the company. Victoria's recent behavior seemed to confirm his long-held suspicions about her fitness for the role. Meanwhile, Marcus was facing his own challenges. Word had spread through the neighborhood that Victoria Hartwell's groundskeeper was available for freelance work, and he found himself busier than he had been in years. But with success came complications. "You're that homeless guy who's working for the rich lady, right?" asked Tom Morrison, a contractor who had hired Marcus to consult on a difficult pipe replacement. "Living pretty well now, I bet," the comment stung because it reduced his relationship with Victoria to a simple transaction, implying that he was somehow taking advantage of her generosity. Marcus had been careful to earn every dollar of his salary, often working longer hours than necessary to ensure Victoria felt she was getting full value for her investment in him. More troubling were the whispered conversations he overheard among the mansion's staff. The housekeeper, the security guard, even the postal carrier seemed to have opinions about the homeless man who had somehow gained access to Victoria Hartwell's private world. One evening, as Marcus and Victoria worked together to repair a damaged section of the estate's stone wall, she broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "People are talking," she said, not looking up from the mortar she was mixing. "I know," Marcus replied. "Does it bother you?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "It bothers me that people assume they understand our situation when they know nothing about either of us. It bothers me that they think wealth gives them the right to judge how I choose to live my life. And it bothers me," Marcus said, setting down his trowel, "that they assume I'm here because I want something from you, instead of because I genuinely enjoy your company." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "My uncle thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. He's been talking to board members, suggesting that my judgment has been compromised. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January air. What does that mean? It means that if I'm not careful, I could lose control of the company my family built. And if that happens, a lot of good people will suffer the consequences. The weight of Victoria's revelation settled between them like a stone. Marcus realized that their friendship, whatever it was becoming, existed in a larger context of power, responsibility, and family legacy that he was only beginning to understand. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Victoria looked at him. This man who had appeared at her gate seeking only a meal and had somehow become the most trusted person in her life. "I want to be worthy of the faith you've shown in me. And I want to prove that choosing to see the best in people isn't a weakness. It's the strongest thing a person can do." As they finished repairing the wall that evening, both Marcus and Victoria understood that they were building more than just a garden or fixing more than just broken stones. They were creating something that their respective worlds might not understand or accept, but that felt more real and valuable than anything either of them had known in years. The crisis came on a Wednesday morning in February, when Victoria arrived at her office to find an emergency board meeting already in session. Her uncle Charles sat at the head of the conference table, her usual seat, with a stack of documents spread before him and an expression of grave concern that Victoria immediately recognized as calculated theater. "Victoria, thank you for joining us," Charles said with false warmth. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention." His board members, 12 executives who had guided Hartwell Industries through decades of growth, looked uncomfortable but determined. Victoria took a seat at the opposite end of the table, her mind racing through possible scenarios. "What concerns?" she asked, keeping her voice level. Robert Simmons cleared his throat. "There have been some irregular financial transactions, large sums moved without proper board approval, property purchases that seem questionable from a business perspective." Victoria's heart sank as she realized they had discovered her purchase of Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment building. "Those were personal investments made with my own funds. I'm not required to seek board approval for my private financial decisions." "Normally, no," Charles agreed smoothly. "But when those decisions suggest a pattern of erratic judgment, the board has a responsibility to consider whether that judgment extends to your leadership of this company." Margaret Phillips, the board's longest-serving member and one of Victoria's few allies, spoke up. "What exactly are you suggesting, Charles?" "I'm suggesting that Victoria has been under considerable stress lately. Her behavior has become increasingly unpredictable. She's missed important meetings, delayed crucial decisions, and—" he paused dramatically. "She's formed an inappropriate relationship with a homeless man who now lives on her property." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria felt her face flush with anger, not at being questioned, but at the way Charles had reduced Marcus to a caricature designed to make the board question her competence. "Marcus Delacroix is a skilled craftsman who manages my estate's maintenance," Victoria said firmly. "His living situation before I hired him is irrelevant to his qualifications or my judgment in employing him." "Is it?" Charles opened a manila folder and slid several photographs across the table. "These were taken by a private investigator. They show you spending considerable time with this man, working alongside him like a common laborer." Victoria looked at the photos. Images of her and Marcus working in the garden, talking by the cottage, sharing coffee on the estate's back terrace. The invasion of privacy made her stomach turn. But more than that, she was struck by how happy she looked in the pictures. When had she last felt the genuine joy that was evident on her face as she knelt beside Marcus among the flower beds? "I fail to see how my choice to take an active interest in my property's maintenance reflects poorly on my business judgment," Victoria said. "The concern," said board member David Chen, speaking carefully, "is that you seem to have lost perspective On appropriate boundaries. On your role and responsibilities. Charles leaned forward. Victoria, no one doubts your intelligence or your dedication to this company. But grief can affect people in unexpected ways, and perhaps the stress of leadership has... Grief? Victoria's voice sharpened. What grief? The loss of your father, the isolation that comes with your position, the lack of meaningful relationships in your life. It's understandable that you might form an inappropriate attachment to someone who shows you attention. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Victoria realized that Charles had been planning this moment for months, waiting for any sign of vulnerability he could exploit. Her friendship with Marcus had simply provided the ammunition he needed. I see, Victoria said quietly. And what exactly do you propose? Charles exchanged glances with several board members. We think you should take a leave of absence, 6 months, perhaps a year. Time to gain some perspective, to address whatever personal issues are affecting your judgment. The company would be in capable hands. I've been CFO for 20 years, and I understand the business as well as anyone. Victoria looked around the table at faces she had known for years. People who had worked with her father, who had watched her grow from a nervous young woman into a capable executive. Some looked genuinely concerned, others merely uncomfortable. A few, she realized, had already made their decision. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to call for a vote of no confidence, Charles said, with false regret. I'd hate for it to come to that, but the board has a fiduciary responsibility to the company and its shareholders. Victoria stood slowly, gathering her dignity around her like armor. I'll need some time to consider your recommendation. Of course, Charles said magnanimously. Take all the time you need. Victoria left the building in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just occurred. By the time she reached her car, anger had replaced shock. Charles had orchestrated this ambush carefully, using her growing friendship with Marcus as evidence of instability while positioning himself as the reasonable alternative. She drove home through the early afternoon traffic, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to process the betrayal. When she arrived at the estate, she found Marcus in the cottage's kitchen, preparing lunch with ingredients from the herb garden they had planted together. You're home early, he said, then stopped when he saw her expression. What's wrong? Victoria sank into one of the cottage's simple wooden chairs, suddenly exhausted. My uncle is trying to remove me as CEO. He's convinced the board that I'm mentally unstable, and he's using our friendship as evidence. Marcus set down the knife he had been using to chop vegetables. Because of me. Because of his ambition, Victoria corrected firmly. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. I've just given him the excuse he needed. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. What does this mean for you? For the company? It means I have to choose between fighting for control of my family's business and protecting the people I care about from becoming collateral damage in that fight, including me. Victoria looked at him, this man who had brought honesty and purpose back into her life, who had shown her what it meant to find joy in simple things, who had helped her remember who she was beneath the weight of inherited expectations. I won't let them use you as a weapon against me, she said. But I also can't pretend that our friendship exists in a vacuum. My choices affect other people, thousands of employees, communities that depend on Hartwell Industries for their economic stability. Marcus reached across the small table and took her hand. What do you need from me? The simple question, offered without conditions or expectations, nearly broke Victoria's composure. I need to know that whatever happens, whatever choice I make, you'll understand that it's not about what I want, it's about what's right. I understand, Marcus said. But Victoria, I need you to understand something too. I've been on the bottom, and I've seen how the world treats people who have nothing. You're not just fighting for a company, you're fighting for the right to use your position to help people who can't help themselves. That matters. That evening, Victoria sat alone in her father's study, surrounded by the portraits and artifacts of 3 generations of Hartwell leadership. In her hands, she held a simple wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her mother, not the expensive pieces Victoria wore to corporate functions, but the modest rings and necklaces that had meant something personal. Her mother had died when Victoria was 15, too young to benefit from a woman's wisdom about love, relationships, and the courage required to follow your heart when the world expected you to follow convention. But looking at the simple gold band her mother had worn daily, Victoria thought she understood something her mother might have told her, that the most important decisions in life weren't about what was safe or expected, but about what was true. The question now was whether Victoria had the courage to fight for that truth, knowing that the battle ahead would test everything she believed about power, love, and the price of authentic connection in a world that often punished both. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under the cottage door sometime before dawn, with no return address, and Victoria's name written in careful block letters. Marcus found it when he stepped outside to check the weather and immediately recognized the weight of something significant. Victoria was in the mansion's study, preparing for what she expected would be her final board meeting as CEO of Hartwell Industries, when Marcus knocked softly on the door. "This was left for you," he said, handing her the envelope with a gravity that made her look up from her laptop. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A letter written in the same careful handwriting as her name on the envelope. Victoria read it. Once then again, her face growing pale. "What is it?" Marcus asked. Victoria handed him the letter without speaking. Marcus read the words that would change everything they thought they knew about their connection. "Ms. Hartwell, I worked for Morrison Construction for 37 years before I retired. I know about what happened to Marcus Delacroix's business, and I know who was behind it. If you want the truth about how your uncle destroyed that man's life to benefit Hartwell Industries, meet me at Lou Mitchell's diner on Jackson Street tomorrow at 8 a.m. Come alone. A friend." Marcus sank into the chair across from Victoria's desk, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. "Morrison Construction. That's the company that bought out most of my contracts when my business failed." "I remember," Victoria said quietly. "We acquired Morrison 6 months later as part of our expansion into the residential market." She paused, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed clicking into place. Charles oversaw that acquisition personally. The next morning, Victoria sat in a booth at Lou Mitchell's Diner, a Chicago institution that had been serving coffee and eggs to working people since 1923. At exactly 8 o'clock, an elderly man in a worn Carhartt jacket approached her table. "Miss Hartwell, I'm Bill Kowalski." He slid into the booth across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that the waitress had automatically filled. "Thanks for coming, Mr. Kowalski. What you wrote in your letter—" "Let me start from the beginning," Bill interrupted. "I was Morrison's project manager for over 20 years. Good company, family-owned, never did anything shady until your uncle started sniffing around." Bill opened a manila folder and spread several documents across the table between them. "See? Marcus Delacroix had something Morrison wanted. Contracts with 3 major property management companies. Good steady work that would have set Morrison up for years." Victoria recognized the property management companies' names. They were all current Hartwell Industries clients. Problem was, Delacroix Plumbing had those contracts locked up tight. 20-year relationships, stellar reputation, prices that were fair but competitive. Morrison couldn't figure out how to muscle in. Bill took a sip of coffee. That's when your uncle approached Morrison's owner with a proposition. Victoria's stomach began to sink as she sensed where this story was heading. Charles Hartwell told Morrison that Hartwell Industries was planning to acquire residential contractors as part of a new strategic initiative. He said if Morrison could secure the Delacroix contracts, he'd guarantee that Hartwell would buy Morrison within 6 months at a premium price. Bill slid a photocopied document across the table. "This is the agreement they signed," Charles promised. Morrison 20% above market value for their company, contingent on their acquisition of specific contracts, including all of Delacroix's major accounts. Victoria studied the document, recognizing her uncle's signature at the bottom. But how did Morrison get Marcus's contracts? His customers were loyal. Bill's expression darkened. Your uncle provided inside information about the property management, company's financial situations, rent payment patterns, maintenance budgets, planned renovations. Information that Morrison used to underbid Delacroix by exactly the right amount to win those contracts. Inside information that Charles would have had access to through Hartwell's existing relationships with those companies, Victoria said. Understanding dawning. Exactly. Marcus never had a fair chance to compete. Morrison knew exactly what to bid because your uncle told them what the property managers could afford to pay. Victoria felt sick. And when Marcus lost those contracts, his business started hemorrhaging money right when his wife got sick. No major income, medical bills piling up, forced to mortgage everything to keep her in treatment. Bill gathered the documents back into his folder. Marcus Delacroix lost his business because your uncle decided it was worth destroying a man's life to make a deal. Why are you telling me this? Victoria asked. Why now? Bill leaned back in the booth, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. Because I've been carrying this secret for 2 years, and it's been eating at me. When Morrison's owner sold to your uncle, he made us all sign non-disclosure agreements. Said if any of us talked about the Delacroix situation, we'd lose our pensions. But you're talking now. I'm 71 years old, and my pension's already vested. More than that, I heard through the construction grapevine that Delacroix was homeless, that he'd lost everything. Bill's voice grew heavy with emotion. Good men don't deserve to suffer for other people's greed. Victoria stared at the documents, her mind racing through the implications. Do you have copies of everything? Everything. The original agreement. Between your uncle and Morrison. Emails discussing the bidding strategy. Financial records showing how Morrison used Hartwell's inside information. Bill slid a flash drive across the table. It's all here. An hour later, Victoria sat in her car in the diner's parking lot, staring at the flash drive that contained evidence of her uncle's betrayal. Not just betrayal of her and the company, but the deliberate destruction of Marcus's life for financial gain. She drove home slowly, processing the magnitude of what she had learned. Marcus was working in the garden when she arrived, and something in her expression made him set down his tools immediately. What did you find out? He asked. Victoria told him everything. She watched his face change as she described the conspiracy that had cost him his business, his home, his financial security. When she finished, Marcus was silent for a long time, staring at the ground between his feet. So it wasn't just bad luck, he said finally. Someone deliberately destroyed my business while Sarah was dying. Yes, your uncle. Yes. Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the garden, his back to Victoria. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. At his sides, Marcus, she said softly, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know you didn't. He turned to face her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite identify. But now you do, and that changes everything. Does it? Marcus looked at her. This woman who had given him back his dignity, who had shown him that his life still had value, who had become the closest thing to love he had felt since Sarah's death. Now he knew that her family's wealth had been built at least in part on the ruins of his own life. I don't know, he said honestly. I need time to think. That evening, Marcus sat alone in the cottage that Victoria had given him, surrounded by furniture he had chosen and tools he had organized, in a space that had begun to feel like home. On the kitchen table lay the flash drive containing proof that his suffering had been orchestrated by the uncle of the woman he was falling in love with. The irony was brutal and complete. Victoria Hartwell, who had restored his faith in human Goodness belonged to the family that had destroyed his life. The woman who had shown him that starting over was possible was connected to the very people who had made starting over necessary. Outside his window, the garden they had planted together was beginning to show the first signs of spring growth. Tomorrow he would have to decide whether the connection they had built could survive the revelation that fate, or Charles Hartwell's greed, had brought them together for reasons far more complex than either of them had imagined. The question that would determine both their futures was simple but devastating. Could love flourish when planted in soil poisoned by betrayal, even if that betrayal belonged to the past and had been committed by someone else entirely? For 3 days after the revelation about Charles's conspiracy, Marcus and Victoria barely spoke. They moved around the estate like polite strangers, their easy intimacy replaced by a careful distance that hurt more than any argument could have. Victoria threw herself into investigating the evidence Bill Kowalski had provided, while Marcus worked in the garden with a mechanical precision that spoke of a man trying not to think. Victoria's study became a war room. She spread documents across every available surface, cross-referencing bank records with acquisition timelines, building a case that would not only expose Charles's crime, but potentially implicate him in corporate fraud. Margaret, her loyal assistant, worked overtime helping to organize the evidence, asking no questions about why Victoria had suddenly become obsessed with a 2-year-old construction deal. The Morrison acquisition netted Hartwell Industries $12 million in new contracts, Victoria told Margaret as they reviewed the financial records. Charles received a substantial bonus that year, $200,000 for exceptional strategic planning. Blood money, Margaret said, quietly, then immediately looked apologetic for speaking so bluntly. Exactly, Victoria agreed. He profited from destroying Marcus's life, then had the audacity to use that same destruction as evidence that I'm unfit to lead this company. But even as Victoria built her case against Charles, she struggled with the larger question of what justice would look like. Exposing her uncle would destroy him, his career, his reputation, possibly his freedom if criminal charges were filed. It would also shatter the family that, despite everything, had been the foundation of her life. More troubling was the uncertainty about Marcus. Since learning the truth, he had become withdrawn, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was wrestling with something larger than just anger at Charles. Victoria wanted to comfort him, to help him process this revelation, but she sensed that her presence as a Hartwell might be making his struggle more difficult rather than easier. On Saturday morning, Victoria found Marcus in the cottage, his few possessions packed neatly in the same 2 duffel bags he had arrived with. Her heart stopped. "You're leaving." Marcus looked up from folding his clothes, his expression carefully neutral. "I think it's best, because of what Charles did. Because of what it means." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped between his knees. "Victoria, I've spent weeks feeling grateful to you for giving me a second chance, for seeing past my circumstances to who I really am. But now I find out that those circumstances, losing my business, becoming homeless, being desperate enough to knock on your door, all of it happened because your family destroyed my life." Victoria sat in the cottage's single chair, maintaining distance but staying close enough to see the pain in his eyes. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't. That's what makes this so complicated." Marcus ran his hands through his graying hair. "If Charles had been a stranger, someone with no connection to you, this would be simpler. I'd be angry, I'd want justice, but it wouldn't change what's grown between us. But because he's my uncle, because he's your uncle, and because I'm falling in love with you, I can't tell where justice ends and revenge begins. I can't separate my feelings for you from my need to see him pay for what he did." The admission that he was falling in love with her hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had been hoping for those words for weeks, but hearing them now, shadowed by betrayal and uncertainty, made them bittersweet rather than joyful. "What if we could separate?" "Them," Victoria asked carefully. What if there was a way to get justice for what Charles did without it affecting us? Marcus looked at her with something that might have been hope. How? Victoria took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything. I'm going to expose him. I'm going to present the evidence to the board, to the authorities if necessary. I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did to you and probably to other people over the years. And then, I'm going to rebuild your business, not as charity, not as compensation, but as restitution. What you lost because of Hartwell Industries will restore. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What would that cost you? My relationship with my family, probably. My uncle's career, certainly. Maybe my own position if the board decides that exposing a family member shows poor judgment. Victoria met his eyes. But keeping the truth hidden would cost me more. Victoria, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice was firm, resolute. Not because of my feelings for you, though those matter more than I can say. I have to do this because it's right. Because people like Mrs. Rodriguez and the families who depend on Hartwell Industries for their livelihoods deserve to know that their company is run by people who value integrity over profit. Marcus unpacked his bags that afternoon, but the crisis had forced both of them to confront questions they hadn't been ready to ask. Could their relationship survive the weight of corporate conspiracy and family betrayal? Was love strong enough to overcome the fact that Victoria's prosperity was built, however indirectly, on Marcus's suffering? That evening, Victoria called an emergency meeting with Margaret and the company's head of legal affairs, Patricia Wong. In the study where her father's portrait watched over them, Victoria laid out the evidence of Charles's conspiracy. This is substantial, Patricia said after reviewing the documents for 2 hours. If these allegations are proven, Mr. Hartwell could face criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and potentially racketeering. What about the company's liability? Victoria asked. Significant. The victims of this conspiracy, not just Mr. Delacroix, but potentially others, would have grounds for substantial civil suits. We could be looking at tens of millions in damages. Margaret, who had been quiet during the legal discussion, finally spoke. Miss Hartwell, are you certain you want to pursue this? The personal cost of not pursuing it would be higher, Victoria said firmly. I won't run a company built on other people's suffering. Over the next week, Victoria worked with Patricia to prepare a comprehensive presentation for the board. They traced the paper trail of Charles's conspiracy, documented the financial benefits that had flowed to both him and the company, and outlined a plan for making restitution to the affected parties. Marcus, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. Word of the impending board meeting had somehow leaked, and speculation was running rampant among Chicago's business community. Several former clients reached out to him, having heard through the grapevine that he might be starting a new business. The interest was gratifying but also overwhelming. Marcus hadn't thought seriously about rebuilding his professional life until Victoria had forced him to consider the possibility. It wouldn't be the same, he told Victoria as they worked together. In the garden one evening, the business I lost was built over 30 years. The relationships, the reputation, the trust, that can't be restored with money alone. No, Victoria agreed, carefully transplanting seedlings they had started from seed. But maybe it can be rebuilt with time and commitment. Maybe the experience you've gained, the perspective you've developed, would make a new business even better than the old one. Marcus considered this as he watched Victoria's hands work in the soil. Her manicured nails were dirty, her expensive clothes stained with earth, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. The woman who had inherited billions was kneeling in a garden, planting seeds that wouldn't bloom for months, because she believed in the value of nurturing something from nothing. If I rebuild the business, he said carefully, and if this between us becomes something permanent, people will always wonder about my motives. They'll say, I seduced a lonely billionaire to get my company back. Victoria looked up from the seedlings. dirt smudged on her cheek. "And if we don't pursue this, if I don't expose Charles and you don't rebuild your business, people will always wonder if we're just hiding from the truth. They'll say, I protected my family at the expense of justice, and you accepted charity. Because it was easier than fighting." The truth of her words settled between them like a challenge. They could choose the safe path, maintain the status quo, protect their growing relationship from outside scrutiny, avoid the complicated questions that justice would raise. Or they could choose the difficult path, fight for what was right, knowing that the battle might destroy everything they had built together. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked, echoing the question Victoria had asked him weeks earlier. Victoria looked at the garden they had created together, at the cottage where Marcus had begun to rebuild his life, at the mansion that represented everything she had inherited and everything she might lose. "I want to prove that love doesn't have to be built on comfortable lies," she said finally. "I want to show that two people can choose truth over safety and still find happiness together." As they finished their planting that evening, both Victoria and Marcus understood that they were approaching the moment when their private struggle would become public, when the relationship they had nurtured in the quiet safety of the estate would be tested by the harsh light of corporate warfare and family betrayal. The question was no longer whether they could survive that test, but whether they had the courage to face it together. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Industries building had never felt more like a courtroom. Victoria arrived 30 minutes early, her presentation materials arranged with military precision on the mahogany table that had hosted 4 decades of corporate decisions. Patricia Wong sat beside her, legal documents organized in neat stacks, while Margaret operated the room's presentation equipment with the efficiency of someone who understood that careers would be decided in the next 2 hours. Charles arrived, precisely on time, his confidence evident in the easy way he greeted each board member, the familiar jokes he shared with longtime colleagues. He had dressed for victory, an expensive suit that projected authority, cufflinks that had belonged to Victoria's father, a demeanor that suggested a man comfortable with power. "Before we address the agenda items," Charles said as the meeting opened, "I think we should discuss the elephant in the room. Victoria's continued relationship with this homeless man has created a public relations nightmare for the company." Victoria felt her temper flare, but kept her voice level. "I wasn't aware that my personal relationships were board business, Charles. They become board business when they affect your judgment and the company's reputation," Robert Simmons interjected. "There are rumors circulating that could damage Hartwell Industries' standing in the business community." Victoria looked around the table at faces she had known for years, reading the mixture of concern, embarrassment, and curiosity in their expressions. These were good people mostly, who had built successful careers by making careful, conservative decisions. The idea that their CEO was involved with a homeless man challenged every assumption they held about appropriate behavior for someone in her position. "I understand your concerns," Victoria said calmly, "but before we discuss my personal life, I think you should know about some irregularities I've discovered in our recent acquisitions." Charles's confident expression flickered slightly. "What irregularities?" Victoria nodded to Margaret, who activated the presentation screen. The first slide showed the Morrison Construction acquisition timeline, with key dates highlighted in red. 2 years ago, Hartwell Industries acquired Morrison Construction for $28 million, Victoria began. At the time, it seemed like a smart strategic move, gaining access to residential contracts and expanding our market share. "It was a smart move," Charles interrupted. "I negotiated that deal personally." "Yes, you did." Victoria clicked to the next slide, which showed the contracts Morrison had acquired immediately before the Hartwell purchase. "What I find interesting is how Morrison managed to secure several major contracts just months before we bought them, contracts that significantly increased their value." Margaret Phillips leaned forward. "What kind of contracts?" "Property management. Accounts that had been held by other contractors for decades, long-term relationships that were suddenly broken when Morrison submitted dramatically lower bids. Victoria clicked again, and Marcus's name appeared on the screen beside a photo of his former business. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They recognized him from the photographs Charles had shown them weeks earlier. Delacroix Plumbing Solutions was one of those contractors, Victoria continued. A family business that had served the same clients for over 20 years, with an impeccable reputation and competitive pricing. I don't see the relevance, Charles began. The relevance, Victoria said firmly, is that Morrison was able to underbid Delacroix because someone provided them with inside information about the property management company's budgets and payment schedules. The room fell silent. Patricia Wong stood and distributed copies of the documents Bill Kowalski had provided. These are copies of emails and financial records showing how Morrison obtained confidential information about Hartwell Industries' existing clients, Patricia explained. Information that could only have come from someone with access to our internal financial data. Charles's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. These could be fabricated. Disgruntled employees, industrial espionage. They could. A B, Victoria agreed, except for this. The next slide showed a copy of the agreement between Charles and Morrison's owner, complete with signatures and witness statements. This document, signed by you, Charles, guarantees Morrison a premium price for their company contingent on their acquisition of specific contracts, including all of Delacroix's major accounts. David Chen whistled softly. This is a smoking gun. Charles stood abruptly. This is a fabrication designed to distract from Victoria's poor judgment. She's so infatuated with this homeless man that she's willing to destroy her own family to protect him. Actually, said a new voice from the boardroom door, I think Victoria is trying to protect her family from you. Everyone turned as Marcus entered the room, dressed in a simple but well-fitted suit, carrying a leather briefcase that Victoria had never seen before. His presence transformed the atmosphere. No longer the object of pity or scandal, but a man with dignity and purpose, demanding justice. Mr. Delacroix, Charles said coldly, this is a private board meeting. Nothing about my life has been private since you decided to destroy it, Marcus replied calmly. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing a document bearing the seal of a Chicago notary public. This is my original business license, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had found his footing again. Issued 31 years ago when I started Delacroix Plumbing Solutions with $2,000 and a belief that honest work would always find its reward. He looked directly at Charles. You took that from me. Not just the business, but the belief. You made me think I had failed when what really happened was that I had been betrayed. The silence in the room was deafening. Charles Hartwell stood at the head of the boardroom table, his carefully constructed world crumbling with each passing moment. The confidence that had carried him through decades of corporate maneuvering was replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered man. This is an elaborate conspiracy, he said, his voice rising slightly. Victoria has been manipulated by this man into believing... Stop! The word came from Margaret Phillips, the board's most senior member, who had been silent throughout the presentation. She stood slowly, her 73 years lending gravity to her movement. Charles, I've known you for 25 years. I watched you grow from an ambitious young executive into a leader I respected. Don't destroy that legacy with lies. Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Mrs. Phillips, if I may, these are testimonials from my former clients, people who worked with Delacroix Plumbing Solutions for over 2 decades. I gathered them because I wanted this board to understand what was destroyed when Mr. Hartwell decided to eliminate my business. He handed copies to each board member. Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez, whose heating system I maintained for 15 years. She wrote that I never charged her for emergency calls because I knew she was raising 3 grandchildren on a fixed income. Mr. James Patterson, whose restaurant's kitchen I kept running through health inspections and busy seasons. He wrote that he trusted me with keys to his business because he knew I valued his success as much as my own. Victoria watched the board members read the testimonials, saw their expressions change as they realized that Marcus wasn't just a victim of Charles's conspiracy. He was a man whose life's work had meant something profound to the people he served. "This is what you destroyed," Marcus said, looking directly at Charles. "Not just a business, but relationships built on trust and mutual respect. Communities where people knew they could depend on each other." Robert Simmons cleared his throat. "Mr. Delacroix, while we're all sympathetic to your situation, the question before this board is whether Ms. Hartwell's relationship with you has compromised her judgment as CEO. Marcus nodded respectfully. "Mr. Simmons, you're right to be concerned about judgment, but I'd like you to consider whose judgment has actually been compromised here." He moved to the presentation screen and pointed to the financial projections. Victoria had prepared. "Miss Hartwell discovered this conspiracy 3 weeks ago. Since then, she's worked with your legal department to calculate the full extent of the damage, not just to me, but to other contractors who may have been similarly targeted. She's prepared a restitution plan that will cost Hartwell Industries approximately $12 million. David Chen looked up sharply. $12 million? The same amount the company profited from Mr. Hartwell's conspiracy, Victoria said quietly. "I'm proposing that we establish a fund to compensate the victims of these practices and to ensure this never happens again." Charles laughed bitterly. "You're willing to bankrupt the company to salve your conscience over a homeless man? And you willing to do what's right," Victoria replied, "even when it's expensive." Marcus returned to his briefcase and withdrew one final document. "There's something else the board should know. Yesterday, I filed papers to re-establish Delacroix Plumbing Solutions as a legitimate business entity." Victoria felt her heart skip. Marcus hadn't told her about this development. "I'm not asking Hartwell Industries for charity or restitution," Marcus continued. "I'm asking for the opportunity to earn back what was taken from me. Ms. Hartwell has offered to provide initial contracts to help me rebuild, but every job will be bid competitively, and every dollar will be earned through quality work." Margaret Phillips smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Mr. Delacroix, that's exactly what I would expect from someone who built the kind of business you described." Charles played his final card. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Victoria has compromised her objectivity. She's romantically involved with this man." "Yes, I am." Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood and faced the board directly. "I'm in love with Marcus Delacroix, not because he needed my help, but because he showed me what integrity looks like when it costs everything you have." The admission created a moment of profound silence. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to be worthy of the legacy my father left me," Victoria continued, "but I've learned something important these past few months. A legacy isn't about preserving what came before. It's about ensuring that what comes next is better." She gestured toward the evidence spread across the table. "Charles's actions violated every principle this company was built on. If we allow that to continue, if we prioritize family loyalty over fundamental decency, then we don't deserve to lead anything." Patricia Wong stood and addressed the board formally. "Based on the evidence presented today, I recommend that Charles Hartwell be immediately suspended pending a full investigation. I also recommend that the board vote on Ms. Hartwell's proposal for restitution and reform." The vote was swift and decisive. Charles Hartwell was suspended by a margin of 11-1. He cast the only vote in his own favor. The restitution fund was approved unanimously. As Charles gathered his belongings and left the boardroom for the last time, Victoria felt no triumph, only sadness for what his ambition had cost everyone involved. Marcus approached her as the board members filed out. You didn't have to tell them about us. Yes, I did, Victoria said, taking his hand in front of the remaining executives. Because the most important thing I've learned is that love isn't something to hide. It's something to build a life on. Outside, the boardroom windows, Chicago stretched toward the horizon, a city full of people working to build something meaningful from whatever circumstances they'd been given. And in that moment, both Victoria and Marcus understood that they had chosen to be among them. 1 year later, the cottage garden was in full bloom. Roses climbed the trellises Marcus had built, herbs flourished in neat rows, and the vegetable patch produced enough tomatoes to share with neighbors. Victoria knelt among the flowers, her hands dirty and her heart light, watching Marcus install a new irrigation system with the methodical precision that had first impressed her. The transformation in both their lives had been gradual but profound. Marcus's rebuilt business, Delacroix Plumbing Solutions 2, employed 6 people and had a waiting list of clients who valued quality work and honest pricing. He had kept his office small deliberately, choosing relationships over expansion, craftsmanship over profit maximization. Victoria had restructured Hartwell Industries around principles that honored her grandfather's original vision while reflecting the wisdom she had gained through love and loss. The company now included an ethics board with real authority, mandatory transparency in all acquisitions, and a foundation that provided interest-free loans to small businesses destroyed by corporate malfeasance. The irrigation timer should be set for early morning, Marcus said, wiping his hands on a towel. Sarah always said that watering at dawn gave plants the strength they needed for whatever the day might bring. Victoria had learned not to feel jealous when Marcus spoke of his late wife. Sarah's memory had become part of their shared foundation, a reminder that love could be honored by creating new love rather than diminished by it. Speaking of dawn, Victoria said, brushing soil from her knees, Mrs. Rodriguez called. She wants to know if you can look at her new apartment's kitchen sink tomorrow morning. After the Hartwell Industries investigation, Victoria had renovated the entire apartment building she had purchased, creating affordable housing for elderly residents while ensuring they would never face displacement again. Mrs. Rodriguez had become their unofficial neighborhood coordinator, keeping track of who needed help and making sure no one was forgotten. Of course, Marcus said, but I should warn you, she's going to try to feed me again. Yesterday it was homemade tamales. I'm running out of room in my refrigerator for all the food people keep giving me. Victoria smiled. Marcus's clients had a habit of treating him like family, bringing meals and gifts that spoke to the relationships he built alongside the pipes he fixed. It was exactly the kind of business he had always wanted to run, one where success was measured not just in profit, but in the trust people placed in him. That evening, they sat on the cottage's front porch, watching the sun set behind the mansion's elegant silhouette. Victoria had been offered several opportunities to sell the estate and buy something smaller, more suited to their changed lifestyle, but she had chosen to stay. The mansion now hosted fundraising events for local charities, business meetings that emphasized ethical practices, and holiday gatherings for Marcus's employees and their families. I have something for you, Marcus said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box and held it out to Victoria with hands that were steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Victoria's heart stopped. They had talked about marriage in abstract terms, about the future they wanted to build together, but this felt sudden and perfect and exactly right. Before you open it, Marcus said, I need you to know something. I didn't ask you to marry me because you saved my life, or because you restored my business, or because you chose justice over family loyalty. I'm asking you to marry me because you make me want to plant gardens that won't bloom for years, because you believe in building something beautiful even when it's difficult, because you see possibilities where other people see problems. Victoria opened the box to find a simple gold band, elegant in its understated beauty. Inside the band, she could see an inscription, for tomorrow's garden. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "So is that a yes?" "It's a yes." As Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate man asking for work in exchange for food. A lonely woman choosing to trust a stranger. Two people discovering that love could grow in the most unlikely soil if tended with patience and courage. Their wedding 6 months later was held in the cottage garden, surrounded by friends who had watched their love story unfold with wonder and appreciation. Mrs. Rodriguez wept openly during the ceremony. Margaret Phillips, who had become Victoria's closest advisor and friend, served as matron of honor. Bill Kowalski, the retired foreman whose conscience had exposed Charles's conspiracy, walked Victoria down the aisle in place of the father she missed, and the uncle who had betrayed her trust. Marcus's former employees came, along with his new. And Victoria's board of directors attended, no longer questioning her judgment, but celebrating her happiness. The guest list included plumbers and CEOs, social workers and investment bankers, people whose only common ground was their affection for a couple who had proven that love could bridge any divide. The cottage became their primary home, while the mansion served as headquarters for their shared philanthropic work. They established a foundation that provided emergency assistance to families facing medical crises, ensuring that no one would lose everything while fighting for a loved one's life the way Marcus had. Every morning, they worked in the garden together before starting their respective days. Victoria would head to the Hartwell Industries offices, where she continued to build a company worthy of her grandfather's dreams and her own values. Marcus would drive to job sites throughout Chicago, fixing problems and building relationships, with the same patience he brought to nurturing plants. In the evenings, they would return to their cottage and their garden, to the space where they had learned that the most important things in life, love, trust, hope, grew slowly but endured, if given proper care. Standing among the roses that climbed toward their windows, sharing the simple satisfaction of work well done and love freely given, Victoria and Marcus had found something neither wealth nor success had ever provided. The deep contentment that comes from building a life based on what matters most. Their story had begun with broken pipes and desperate hunger. It had grown into something that would last generations, a testament to the truth that love, like gardens, flourishes when planted in good soil and tended with faithful hands.